Today we start the Spiderwick Chronicles Book 3. This is called Lucinda's Secret. So remember, excuse me, Lucinda is the great aunt whose house they're living in. Chapter 1, in which many things are turned inside out. Jared Grace took out a red shirt, turned it inside out, and put it on backward. He tried to do the same with his jeans, but that was beyond him. Arthur Spiderwick's field guide to the fantastical world around you lay atop his pillow, open to a page on protective devices. Jared had consulted the book carefully, not sure if any of it would help much. Since the morning after the Grace kids had returned with the griffin, Thimbletack had been out to get Jared. Every so often he could hear the little brownie in the wall. At other times, Jared thought he saw him out of the corner of his eye. Mostly, though, Jared just wound up the victim of some new prank. So far, his eyelashes had been cut, his shoes had been filled with mud, and something had urinated on his pillow. Mom blamed Simon's new kitten for the last, but Jared knew better. Mallory was completely unsympathetic. "Now you know how it feels," she kept saying. Only Simon seemed at all concerned, and he practically had to be. If Jared hadn't forced Thimbletack to give up the Seeing Stone, Simon might have been roasted over a spit in a goblin camp. Jared tied the laces of his muddy shoe over an inside-out sock. He wished that he could find a way to apologize to Thimbletack. He tried to give back the stone, but the brownie hadn't wanted it. The thing was, he knew that if everything were to happen all over again, he would do exactly what he had done. Just thinking about Simon being held by goblins, while Thimbletack stood around talking in riddles, made Jared angry enough to almost break his laces with the force of the knot. "Jared," Mallory called from downstairs. "Jared, come here a minute." He stood up, tucking the guide under his arm, and took a step toward the stairs. He fell immediately, hitting his hand and knee against the hardwood floor. Somehow, Jared's shoelaces had been tied together. Downstairs, Mallory was standing in the kitchen, holding a glass up to the window so that the water caught the sunlight and cast a rainbow on the wall. Simon sat next to her. Both of Jared's siblings seemed transfixed. "What?" Jared said. He was feeling grumpy and his knee hurt. If all they wanted was to show him how the stupid glass looked, he was going to break something. "Take a sip," Mallory said, handing the glass to him. Jared eyed it suspiciously. Did they spit in it? Why would Mallory want him to drink water? "Go ahead, Jared," Simon said. "We already tried it." The microwave beeped and Simon jumped up to remove a giant mound of chopped meat. The top part was a sickly gray, but the rest of it still looked frozen. "What's that?" Jared asked, peering at the meat. "For Byron," Simon said, dumping it in a huge bowl and adding cornflakes. "He must be getting better. He's always hungry." Jared grinned. Anyone else would be wary of a half-starved griffin recuperating in their carriage house. Not Simon. "Go on," Mallory said. "Drink." Jared took a sip of the water and choked. The liquid burned his mouth and he spat half of it onto the tile floor. The rest slid down his throat like fire. "Are you crazy?" he yelled between bouts of coughing. "What was that?" "Water from the tap," Mallory said. "It all tastes that way." "Then why did you make me drink it?" Jared demanded. Mallory crossed her arms. "Why do you think all this stuff is happening?" "What do you mean?" Jared asked. "I mean that weird things started happening when we found that book, and they're not going to stop until we get rid of it." "Weird stuff was happening before we found it," Jared objected. "It doesn't matter," Mallory said. "Those goblins wanted the guide. I think we should give it to them." The room was silent for a few seconds. Finally, Jared managed a hushed, "What?" "We should get rid of that stupid book," Mallory repeated, "before someone gets hurt, or worse." "We don't even know what's wrong with the water." Jared glared at the sink, anger coiling in his gut. "Who cares?" Mallory said. "Remember what Thimbletack told us? Arthur's field guide is too dangerous." Jared didn't want to think about Thimbletack. "We need the guide," he said. "We wouldn't have even known there was a brownie in the house without it. We wouldn't have known about the troll or the goblins or anything." "And they wouldn't know about us," Mallory said. "It's mine," Jared said. "Stop being so selfish," Mallory shouted. Jared clenched his teeth. How dare she call him selfish? She was just too chicken to keep it. I decide what happens to it, and that's final. I'll show you final. Mallory took a step toward him. If it wasn't for me, you'd be dead. So, Jared said, if it wasn't for me, you'd be dead right back. Mallory took a deep breath. Jared could almost imagine steam coming out of her nose. Exactly. We could all be dead because of that book. The three of them looked down at that book, dangling from Jared's left hand. He turned to Simon, furious. I suppose you agree with her? Simon shrugged uncomfortably. The guide did help us figure out about Thimbletack, and about the stone that lets you see into Fairy. Jared smiled in triumph. But, Simon went on, and Jared's face fell, what if there are more goblins out there? I don't know if we could stop them. What if they got in the house? Or grabbed Mom? Jared shook his head. If Mallory and Simon destroyed the guide, then everything they had done would have been for nothing. What if we give back the guide and they keep coming after us? Why would they do that? Mallory demanded. We'd still know about the guide, said Jared, and we'd still know fairies are real. They might think we'd make another guide. I'd make sure you didn't, said Mallory. Jared turned to Simon, who was pushing a wooden spoon through the half-frozen mess of meat and cereal. And what about the griffin? The goblins wanted Byron, didn't they? Are we going to give him back too? No, said Simon, looking out at the faded curtains into the yard. We can't let Byron go. He isn't all the way better. No one is looking for Byron, Mallory said. It isn't the same thing at all. Jared tried to think of something that would convince them, something that would prove that they needed the guide. He didn't understand the fairies any more than Simon or Mallory did. He didn't even know why the fairies would want the field guide when the only thing in it was stuff about them. Did the fairies just not want people to see it? The only person who might know the answer was Arthur, and he was long dead. Jared stopped at that thought. There is someone we could ask. Someone who really might know what to do, Jared said. Who? Asked Simon and Mallory in unison. Jared had won. The book was safe, at least for now. He smirked. Aunt Lucinda. Chapter 2, in which many people are mad. It's very sweet of you kids to want to visit your great aunt, Mom said, smiling into the rearview mirror at Jared and Simon. I know she's going to love the cookies you made. Outside the car window, the trees streamed by, patches of yellow and red leaves between bare branches. They didn't make them, Mallory said. All they did was arrange frozen dough on a pan. Jared kicked the back of her seat hard. Hey, Mallory said, turning around and trying to grab her brothers. Jared and Simon snickered. She couldn't quite get them with their seatbelt on. Well, that's more than you did, their mother said. You're still grounded, young lady. All three of you have a week left. I was at fencing practice, Mallory said, slumping in her seat and rolling her eyes. Jared wasn't sure, but it seemed like there was something odd about the way her ears got pink when she said it. Jared absently touched his backpack, feeling the outline of the field guide within, safe and sound, wrapped in a towel. So long as he kept it with him, there was no way that Mallory could get rid of it, and no way the fairies could take it. Besides, maybe Aunt Lucinda knew about the guide. Maybe she was the one who had locked it up in the false bottom of the chest for him to find. If so, maybe she could convince his brother and sister that it was important enough to keep. The hospital where their great aunt lived was huge. It looked more like a manor than an asylum, with massive red brick walls, dozens of windows, and a neatly mown lawn. A wide white stone path edged in rust and gold mums led to an entranceway cut from stone. At least 10 chimneys rose from the black roof. Wow, this place looks older than our house, Simon said. Older, said Mallory, but not nearly as crappy. Mallory, their mother cautioned. Gravel crunched under their tires as they pulled into the parking lot. Their mother chose a spot next to a battered green car and turned off the engine. Does Aunt Lucy know we're coming? Simon asked. I called ahead, said Mrs. Grace, opening the car door and reaching for her purse. I don't know how much they tell her, though, so don't be disappointed if she's not expecting us. I bet we're the first visitors she's had in a long time, Jared said. His mother gave him a look. First of all, that is not a nice thing to say. And second, why are you wearing your shirt inside out? Jared looked down and shrugged. Grandma visits, doesn't she? Mallory asked. Their mother nodded. She comes, but it's hard for her. Lucy was more like a sister than a cousin, and then when she started to deteriorate, Grandma was the one who had to take care of things. Jared wanted to ask what that meant, but something made him hesitate. They walked through the wide walnut doors of the institution. There was a desk in the vestibule, where a uniformed man was sitting, reading a newspaper. He looked up at them and reached for a tan phone. Sign in, please. He nodded toward an open binder. Who are you here to see? Lucinda Spiderwick. Their mother bent over the table and wrote their names. At the sound of the name, the man scowled. Jared decided right then that he didn't like this guy at all. In a few minutes, a nurse in a pink shirt with polka dots appeared. She led them through a maze of off-white hallways filled with stale air and the faint odor of iodine. They passed an empty room where a television flickered, and from somewhere nearby there was the sound of giddy laughter. Jared started to think of the asylums in movies and imagined wild-eyed people in straitjackets biting at their bonds. He peered through the windowed doors as they passed. In one room, a young man in a bathrobe giggled over an upside-down book, while in another a woman sobbed near a window. Jared tried to avert his eyes from the next door, but he heard someone call, My dancing partner is here. Peering in, he saw a wild-haired man press his face against the window. Mr. Byrne, the nurse stepped between Jared and the door. It's all your fault, the man said, showing yellow teeth. Are you okay? Mallory asked. Jared nodded, trying to pretend he wasn't shaking. There's a picture of Aunt Lucinda. Does that happen often? Mrs. Grace asked. No, answered the nurse. I'm very sorry. He's usually very quiet. Before Jared could decide whether this visit was a good idea, the nurse stopped at a closed door, rapped twice, and opened it without waiting for a reply. The room was small and the same not quite white color as the hallway. In the center of the room was a hospital bed with a metal headboard, and sitting up in it, with a comforter wrapped around her legs, was one of the oldest women Jared had ever seen. Her long hair was as white as sugar. Her skin was pale, too, almost transparent. Her back was hunched and twisted to one side. A metal stand by the side of her bed held a bag of clear liquid, with a long tube that connected to the IV in her arm. But her eyes, when they focused on Jared, were bright and alert. "Why don't I shut that window, Miss S?" asked the nurse, moving past a nightstand cluttered with antique photos and knickknacks. "You're going to catch a cold." "No," Lucinda barked, and the nurse stopped mid-stride. Then, in a gentler voice, their great-aunt continued, "Leave it be. I need fresh air." "Hello, Aunt Lucy," Mom said hesitantly. "Do you remember me? I'm Helen." The old lady nodded slightly, appearing to regain her composure. "Of course, Melvina's daughter. Goodness, you're quite a bit older than I remembered." Jared noticed that his mother looked less than pleased by that observation. "These are my sons, Jared and Simon," she said, "and this is my daughter, Mallory. We've been staying in your house, and the children wanted to meet you." Aunt Lucy frowned. "The house? It is not safe for you to stay at the house." "We've had people in to make repairs," Mom said, "and look, the children brought some cookies." "Lovely." The old woman looked at the plate as though it were piled with cockroaches. Jared, Simon, and Mallory exchanged glances. The nurse snorted. "Nothing you can do," the nurse said to Mrs. Grace, not seeming to care that Aunt Lucy could hear her. "She won't eat anything while we're watching." Aunt Lucy narrowed her eyes. "I am not deaf, you know." "You won't try one?" Mom asked, uncovering the sugar cookies and holding the platter out to Aunt Lucinda. "I'm afraid not," said the old woman. "I find that I am quite content." "Perhaps we could talk in the hall," their mother whispered to the nurse. "I had no idea things were still so bad." With a worried look, she put the plate on a side table and left the room with the nurse. Jared grinned at Simon. This was even better than they had hoped. Now they were guaranteed at least a few minutes alone. "Aunt Lucy," Mallory said, speaking fast, "when you told our mom that the house was dangerous, you didn't mean the construction, did you?" "You meant the fairies," said Simon. "It's okay to tell us. We've seen them," Jared put in. Their aunt smiled at them, but it was a sad smile. "Fairies are exactly what I meant," she said, patting the bed beside her. "Come, sit down, you three. Tell me what's happened. Chapter 3, in which stories are told and a theft is discovered. We've seen goblins and a troll and a griffin, Jared told her eagerly as they arranged themselves at the foot of the hospital bed. It was such a relief to be believed. Now, if she would just explain how important the guide was, everything would be okay. And Thimbletack, Mallory put in, picking up a cookie and taking a bite. We've seen him, although we're not sure if he counts as a brownie or a boggart. Right, said Jared, but we need to ask you something important. Thimbletack? Aunt Lucinda asked, patting Mallory's hand. I haven't seen him in ages. How is he? The same, I expect. They're all always the same, aren't they? I don't know, Mallory said. Aunt Lucy reached into the drawer on her side table and brought out a worn green cloth bag, embroidered with stars. Thimbletack loved these. Jared took the bag and peered into it. Silvery jacks next to several stone and clay marbles glinted inside the pouch. They are his? Oh, no, she said. They are mine. Or they were, when I was young enough to play with such things. I'd just like him to have them. The poor thing, all alone in that old house. He must be so glad you've come. Jared didn't think Thimbletack was all that glad, but he didn't say so. Was Arthur your dad? Simon asked. Yes, yes, he was, she said with a sigh. Have you seen his paintings in the house? They nodded. He was a wonderful artist. He used to illustrate advertisements for soda pop and women's stockings. He made paper dolls for Melvina and me. We had a whole folder of them with different dresses for each season. I wonder whatever happened to those things. Jared shrugged. Maybe they're in the attic. It doesn't matter. He's been gone for a long time now. I'm not sure I'd want to see them anyway. Why not? Simon asked. Brings back memories. He left us, you know. She looked down at her thin hands. They were trembling. He went out for a walk one day and never came back. Mother said she had known he was going to leave for a long time. Jared was surprised. He had never given much thought to what Uncle Arthur was like. He thought of the stern, bespectacled face in the library painting. He had wanted to like his great-great-uncle, who could draw and see fairies. But if what Lucinda said was true, then he didn't like Arthur at all. Our dad left too, said Jared. I just wish I knew why. Aunt Lucy turned her head away, but Jared thought he saw the glint of tears in her eyes. She pressed her hands together to make them stop shaking. Maybe he had to move for his job, Simon offered, like our dad. Oh, come on, Simon, Jared said. You can't really believe that load of crap. Shut up, morons, Mallory glared at them. Aunt Lucy, how come you're in this hospital? I mean, you're not crazy. Jared winced, sure that Aunt Lucy would be mad, but she only laughed. His anger faded. After Father left, Mother and I moved one town over to live with his brother. I grew up alongside my cousin Melvina. That's your grandmother. I told her about Thimbletack and about the little sprites, but I don't think she ever really believed me. Mother died when I was only 16. A year later, I moved back into the estate. I tried to use what little money there was to fix the place up. Thimbletack was still there, of course, but there were other things too. Sometimes I saw shapes skulking around in the dark. Then, one day, they stopped hiding. They thought I had Father's book. They would pinch me and poke me and insist that I give it to them, but I didn't have it. Father had taken it with him. He never would have left it behind. Jared started to speak, but his aunt was lost in her memories and didn't seem to notice. One night, the fairies brought me a piece of fruit, just a little thing, the size of a grape and red as a rose. They promised not to hurt me any more. Stupid girl that I was, I took the fruit and sealed my fate. Was it poison? Jared asked, thinking of Snow White and apples. Of a fashion, she said with a strange smile. It tasted better than any food I'd ever imagined. It tasted the way I thought flowers might. It tasted like a song you can't quite put a name to. After that, human food, normal food, was like sawdust and ashes. I couldn't make myself eat it. I would have starved. But you didn't starve, Mallory said. Thanks to the sprites who I played with when I was a child. They fed me and kept me safe. Aunt Lucy smiled beatifically and stretched out one hand. Let me introduce you. Come, my dears. Come and see my niece and nephews. There was a buzzing outside her open window, and what had seemed like floating dust in the sunlight suddenly became creatures the size of walnuts whirring in on iridescent wings. They alighted on the old woman, tangling in her white hair and crawling up the headboard. "Aren't they darling?" their aunt asked. "My sweet little friends." Jared knew what they were. Sprites, like the ones in the woods. But that didn't make it any less eerie to watch them swarm over his aunt. Simon, however, seemed transfixed. Mallory spoke, breaking the hush that had settled over them. "I still don't understand who put you here." "Oh, yes, the hospital," said Aunt Lucy. "Your grandmother, Melvina, became convinced I wasn't well. First, she saw the bruises, and then the lack of appetite. Then something happened. I don't want to frighten you. No, that's not quite true. I do want you to be frightened. I want you to understand how important it is for you to get out of that house. See these marks?" The old woman held out one thin arm. Scars ran deep in her flesh. Simon gasped. "Late one night the monsters came. Little green things with horrible teeth held me down, while a giant one questioned me. I struggled, and their claws scraped my arms and legs. I told them there was no book, that my father had taken it, but nothing I said made any difference. Before that night, my back was straight. Ever since, I have walked hunched over." The marks were the final straw for Melvina. She believed I was cutting myself. She couldn't understand, so she sent me here. One of the fairies, clad only in a spiky green seed pod, flew close and dropped a piece of fruit on the blanket near Simon. Jared blinked. He had been so wrapped up in the story he had nearly forgotten about them. The fruit smelled of fresh grass and honey and was enclosed in a papery skin, but underneath Jared could see the red flesh. Aunt Lucinda stared at it, and her lips began to tremble. "For you," said the little fairies in a unified whisper. Simon picked up the fruit and held it between his fingers. "You're you're not going to eat it, are you?" Jared asked. Just looking made his mouth water. "Of course not," said Simon, but his eyes gleamed greedily. "Don't," said Mallory. Simon brought the fairy fruit closer to his mouth, still turning it. "One bite, just one little taste wouldn't hurt," he said softly. Aunt Lucinda's hand shot out and plucked the fruit from Simon's fingers. She popped it into her mouth and closed her eyes. "Hey," said Simon indignantly, jumping up. Then he looked around, disoriented. "What just happened?" Jared looked at their great aunt. Her hands were shaking even as she clasped them in her lap. "They mean well," she said. "They just don't understand the craving. To them, it is only food." Jared looked at the little fairies. He wasn't sure what they knew or didn't know. "But now you see why the house is too dangerous for you children. You must get your mother to understand, to leave. If they know you're there, they'll think you have the guide, and they will never leave you in peace." "But we do have the guide," Jared said. "That's what we came here to ask you about." "You can't possibly—" "We followed the clues in the library," Jared explained. "See, she does think we should get rid of it," Mallory said. "The library? That means—" Aunt Lucy looked at him with dawning horror. "If you have the guide, you have to get out of the house immediately. Do you understand me?" "The guide's right here." Jared unzipped his backpack and took out the towel-covered book. But when he unwrapped it, the field guide wasn't inside. They were all looking down at an old, worn copy of a cookbook, Microwave Magic. Jared turned to Mallory. "You! You stole it!" He dropped the backpack and went at her with both fists.